So this is the second part of image adjustments. And of course, image adjustments comes from, as I repeatedly say, this top bar here where you have image and move through to adjustments and the subsequent menus that follow. But of course, there are thousands of different ways of adjusting images. Let's take this purple square there, for instance. If we select it on a PC, you press Control-T, and that gives toggle points to this. And if we press Shift and Out at the same time, I'll go from there because it just gives a little bit more space. So Shift Out, this allows me to expand and contract this particular image without changing the ratio of scale within that image. It keeps its ratio, it keeps its scale. And then you press Enter, otherwise known as Apply, once you're happy with that particular size. Just to avoid any confusion, I will switch off the others, so we're just dealing with this at the moment. Now, Control-T, I find that even between my desktop PC and my laptop, the controls and commands change slightly. So really for each individual computer, it does seem that Photoshop has slight differences of command. So not a difficult thing to find, and at worst one just has to phone up customer care if there is an issue with finding out which particular command. However, generally speaking, Control-T gives you these toggle points. If I hold Control only, it means that I can stretch that particular toggle point in any direction. So there we are, I press Control, it gives me that little arrow thing, and that allows me to stretch it around. If we move on the outside of this shape, you can see that the little arrow becomes curved, which allows for a tilt, and the degree of tilt is actually registering here. If you can see this little number here, which at the moment is 35.18 degrees, as I move it back towards the horizontal, it will tend towards, there we are. And that, you see, it's shifting all the time. So that does give you a reference point. So that's one way to change and manipulate an image. And of course, you can shift all these toggle points move, and it's just a question of playing around with them until you're familiar with that. Now, it's one exercise that it's asking me to apply it. If we copy this, so we've got two, and I make one, you notice the copy I've just made is above the one that was there before. If with the purple copy, I make the purple copy slightly transparent and I move it across the other one, it disappears at that point. But if, of course, if I've manipulated it into a different shape and I move it across, you can see through it and see through to what's happening underneath. So an interesting test is to see whether one can actually line it up, having put it in the wrong position, and is it lined up? It's not quite lined up, and you can just play around with maybe shifting toggle points to line it up, maybe shifting toggle points to line it up. So one can invent one's own exercises in terms of understanding how these shapes can be manipulated, and it's just a question of developing fluency with that to allow one creative freedom. So I'll just apply that, which is pressing Enter, and switch that one off. So we have this transparent shape. Play around with these shapes. We can with this shape alone. If we go, for instance, to that pen tool, right-click, freeform pen tool, and I draw a shape in that. Remember, we can cut out that shape, and we then right-click and make a selection, and go to Select and go to Inverse and cut that out. And once one's done that, try Alt, copy, out, copy, out. The copy is just a left click. And so I have 4 of these shapes, and we can then, with each one of these, change the adjustment of the hue and saturation, or the exposure, for instance. You can move the exposure slide. There we're taking it down into a grayscale. Here we're taking it up into a much brighter pink. We can OK that. Here, if we take copy 2, we can go to image. We can go to the adjustments that we have there. We can go to brightness and contrast, and we could play around with that and increase its brightness and see what that does. Its brightness, you can see it again. It's doing something similar, though it doesn't take it to anything like the same degree of bright pinkness. We could maybe move the contrast scale, which for this particular image doesn't actually do very much. So it's a question of experimenting. I'd encourage everyone to experiment with these, but this image on the top toolbar is the place to go for that. Do remember to select your particular item that you want to play around with in this instance, and we go to adjustments, and let's try vibrance and see what vibrance does as we increase the vibrance or decrease the vibrance. That's a very small shift, and that's a very small shift there, but you can see it goes right down to the grayscale there and to a more saturated color as you move up the saturation scale, of course. So that's where to go for these controls, but the primary one is adjustment, hue and saturation, and those 3 scales there, which give you really the greatest control, because you see I've moved that down to a green there. And then you OK it, and then you have these different colors. Remember, the starting point was simply a large blue square for these different patterns. But let's now start applying this to very specific planting and see how that works.